You've got to get paid indeed, as today is all about the non-farm payrolls number out later tonight. Ahead of that key piece of data, we had the markets posting some more green, the Dow up in the order of 50 points or another 0.5%. In case you're wondering what the last couple of days of gains means, well, in fact, the Dow is down just 1% year to date now on the back of what we've seen lately. The S&P 500 in session rallying about 0.9% to close out at 1,090. Let's bring in Bew, who is editorial director and chief economist at the Economist Intelligence Unit. He joins us here on set along with our guest host Michael Price from Stan Chart. Welcome, nice to see you. Thanks for joining us. Perhaps you can make sense of what we're seeing to date. Just this week the data has been fairly good, and it's actually pulled us out of our conversation about whether we're in another downward leg, whether double dips around the corner. What do you make of what we've seen?
I think 1 week's worth of data is probably a bit soon to throw the double dip story right out of the window. Actually, we're not forecasting a double dip. We think that the US is going to escape that, but certainly the mood music in the data over the last few months has been pretty negative, and we don't really see the data we've had in the last few days as really changing that.
It's not just consistent with the mid-cycle slowdown.
Well, I guess it's consistent with this gradual removal of stimulus. I guess what we see and what we expected to see is that in the upswing, clearly there was a lot of restocking going on, there's a lot of bounce back on the corporate side, but there's clearly also a lot of policy stimulus going through the economy. That additional push is gradually waning away now, so you would have expected to see a slowdown, and that's kind of what we're seeing. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're going back into recession, though clearly there's a risk of that, but the data's been pretty poor. I don't really see the last few days as turning the story around. Anyone who starts forecasting a massive resurgence on the back of that, I think, will be really pushing their luck.
Robin, Bernie in Hong Kong here. Michael Price next to you just said before our halftime break, you know, that the U.S. obviously has a great interest in not becoming another Japan. Let me take the opposite tack here. If you don't think we're going to do a double dipper, if you don't think we're going to crash back into recession, what is the most exciting thing going on in the U.S. economy which might provide some bright sparks this year?
Well, in terms of bright spots, I guess the investment and the corporate side is probably the most interesting thing, because we've seen corporate profitability rise very dramatically because of the cost cutting that we've seen. To have cash on hand, so the corporate sector has the ability to do interesting things. And you've already been talking this morning about some of the M&A action that we're starting to see float to the surface. So there's some interest there. I think in terms of macroeconomic growth, though, the best thing we can hope for is a slow, grinding recovery. I'm certainly not expecting to see a dramatic resurgence and GDP growth rising towards 3% over the course of next year. This year's a slightly different story, but we don't expect a double dip either. So I think macroeconomic data is going to be a bit disappointing, but with the corporate sector with cash on hand, you could see a lot of action in financial markets, and that might be a bit of fun.
You know, Michael, we are setting off this key non-farm payrolls number tonight, and what's been interesting about this is the fact that it does drive consumption. If we see a tick up in the unemployment rate, it's going to cause a lot of fears about what that's going to mean for spending. But if you just break down the retail numbers so far, the high end has been an incredibly interesting story. The likes of Hermes, also Tiffany's posting double-digit gains. Are you prepared to keep looking at that sector? Is that where we're going to see the real strength?
No, I think it's literally a tale of two worlds. We see a lot of dichotomy in the whole system, not just in the U.S. retail space, but also between Western markets and emerging markets, right? But I very much agree with Robin that the data actually is weak, but that's actually not necessarily bad for asset markets, because it means that interest rates in the Western world will remain very low. Close to zero, actually. You could even argue negative rates in the Western world. So that potentially is further fueling the boom in emerging markets. And that, of course, later on will lead to the law of unintended consequences, that you're creating another bubble down the road.
But this may be something of a contrarian view, Michael. I read that US stocks, the large caps, the quality names, are very cheap at the moment relative to bonds. In fact, the cheapest that they've been since 1951. So is this a heck of a buying opportunity if you are feeling bold enough?
No, if you share our view that next year's US GDP forecast at 1.4%, as we predict, is the low in US GDP, then yes. I mean, then you should be using this opportunity to build a position on a 12-month view.
Yeah, Robin, how about you?
I think it's also important to remember that the big caps in the US are very exposed to international trends. So the bigger companies in America have a very big share of their business coming out of Asia. Asia's clearly very strong, and you see that actually in other developed markets as well. So when you buy into these big indices, you're actually buying into something which is a lot more global than you might assume, and Asia's so strong at the moment, the big caps are benefiting from that.
That's a very good point there. And the PepsiCos and the conglomerates of the world are having a very different experience than the small, mid-sized enterprises in Peoria, Illinois. Robin, let me throw this out there at you. We kind of did a big loop-de-doop with this Washington Post piece earlier about to further stimulate or not to stimulate. You know, there's a growing chorus saying that, you know, all that money thrown out there hasn't really yielded any results, and at some point just let it deleverage, let it find a base, let it find equilibrium, and then pick up the pieces and look where your base is, where the foundation of your new house is. Concur or non-concur?
Well, I mean, all the stimulus that's been talked about over the course of the last few months or so has actually been pretty modest anyway, so whether they did it or not, I'm not sure it's going to make an enormous difference to the macro story. I think the right policy at the moment is to wait and see. We know the US economy is slowing. As we've already heard, if they slip back into recession, then we could start to have to worry about a Japan-type scenario. Then you'd need to see policy really become very aggressive again. So why do that now? Why not wait, see what growth numbers look like in the second half of the year? If they need to step back in and do something more ambitious, then they do still have room to do so. I know lots of people think that's not true, but we believe it is. But why do it now? Why not wait and see what happens? Because obviously the Fed is doing quite a bit of heavy lifting at the moment. That may well be enough to see us through.
We're out of time, but I've got to ask you the numbers tonight for non-farms: 100,000 loss, 9.6% unemployment. Do you agree, or do you think we'll see something different?
I think, well, obviously the most recent data suggests that it might be a little bit better than that, but I still think some kind of net loss, 50 to 100, something like that. Okay,
thanks for putting on the record. Good to see you around the set this morning. Robert Bew is Editorial Director and Chief Economist at the Economist Intelligence Unit. And we're going to come back to our guest host, Chief Investment Strategist at Standard Chartered, Michael Price, in just a moment, Bernie.